Hello my treasures, it's time for the final day of cards to be revealed for the Festival of Legends set. Today we'll be going over the 22 cards remaining in the set and the cards from yesterday that were revealed for Warlock. So let's begin with the Death Knight cards. The first one is going to be Hardcore Cultist, a 3-cost, 1 Frost Rune, 2 attack, 1 HP undead minion, Battlecry, deal 2 damage, Finale, to all enemies. So because of its finale, it is actually quite of a flexible card. However, there is one downside for a card like this. Even though it is a pretty good AoE board clear on turn 3, most minions nowadays don't actually have 2 HP, thus making it a little bit more awkward to actually use. However, I can still see this scene play because it does help support a lot of the Frost Death Knight decks that currently exist in standard Hearthstone, where it introduces an AoE board clear to get rid of some of your opponent's key taunts while also pinging their own face. The next card that was revealed is a Death Metal Knight, a 3-cost, 3 attack, 4 HP undead minion. Taunt costs health instead of mana if your hero was healed this turn. This is a cool idea that they're having for Blood Death Knight. It does require 2 blood runes, which makes it a little less playable. However, if you are using this in combination with Vampiric Blood and stuff like that, then you're probably going to already be running 3 blood runes instead of just 2. The only downside about this card is there's not too many ways, even in this set, for Blood Death Knight to actually heal. They can gain additional HP, but those additional HP points aren't necessarily going to count as healing, thus making this card a little bit less playable than it might look at first glance. However, if we do keep seeing the lifesteal mechanic as a key identity of the Blood Death Knight subdeck, then this card will become incredibly playable in the future, but until then, it probably isn't going to be the strongest. Now for the Demon Hunter cards, the first one going to be Guitar Solace, a 5-cost, 4 attack, 3 HP, minion with the battle cry. If you control no other minions, draw a spell, minion, and a weapon. Hey, finally a good Soulless. A 5 mana, draw 3 if you have all those types of cards in your deck is quite powerful, especially because it'll allow you to easily access some of your key weapons that you might be running in the deck. And the best thing about this card in particular is the fact that it supports a lot of the other cards that we've seen revealed Demon Hunter in this set. The legendary spell works incredibly good with this card. The weapon that we also saw revealed works pretty well, and even the other minion that gives you a random Demon Hunter weapon whenever your weapon is actually destroyed. There's really probably going to be some type of weapon Demon Hunter deck, and I can't wait to test it out because it always kind of shocked me that we never went down that route before. Now for the next card, which is going to be Taste of Chaos. A 1-cost fail spell, deal 2 damage to a minion. Finale, discover a fail spell. I do think the pool of fail spells currently in standard Hearthstone is small enough where a card like this is going to see quite a bit of play. It's a nice turn 1 removal tool if you need to do it for that, while also generating you an additional removal tool on a later turn, depending on what you randomly discover off of the finale part of the effect. Now let's talk about some Druid cards. First one is going to be Rhyme and Roots, a 4-cost nature spell. Choose one secretly. Summon 3/5/5 ancients in 2 turns or 8/8 giants in 4 turns. If you're playing a card like this, you're probably always going to be choosing the first effect, just because making yourself survive for 4 additional turns is not always going to be the easiest thing, and that makes this card incredibly slow. Honestly, out of all of the legendary spells that we've seen in this set in particular, I think this is probably the one that's the least playable, just because of how much the effects are actually delayed. You have legendary spells that give you advantage right away or just infinite resources. It's just kind of awkward to me that they decided to print a card like this in particular, mainly because of how delayed the effect actually is. There might be some outlier decks where you might want to try to run a card like this, but outside of randomly generating this card, I don't know if anyone is going to try to use it. I might, because it looks like a fun little card to try out, but most of the time you're probably going to be dead before you can actually get the 3/8/8s out. Now, if these tokens weren't just vanilla stat sticks, then there might be actually a chance for a card like this to be popular. Okay, now for the next Druid card, which is Harmonic Moon, a 2-cost spell that gives your hero +2 attack this turn, gain 4 armor, and then it swaps to 4 attack and 2 armor. Good thing good old questline Druid is rotating out, am I right? This would have been a perfect card for that deck. However, as it currently stands, this is probably going to be used mainly in Armored Druid. Even though the deck is going to be missing Brand, you should still be able to pull off a lot of possible combos if you introduce a bunch of new armor gain for that style of deck. It's going to be still a pretty frustrating deck to play against, depending on how consistency they can actually get their big Anubicon combo out, and this card helps a lot with that. Now for the Hunter card, which is going to be Harmonic Soloist, a 3-cost, 4 attack, 2 HP minion with Battle Cry. If you control no other minions, discover and cast a secret. Hey, the secret isn't really going to be much of a secret because it'll probably tell your opponent what you discover. However, it does allow you to run really good secrets without actually having to run them in the deck. The only question is this going to be worth not doing anything on turn 1 or 2 when it comes to minions? Or if you're going to be wanting to actually put down minions and then turn this offline. The stat line by itself is actually pretty decent, but you're probably never going to want to just slam it down on turn 3 if you already have some minions on board. I don't honestly know where this currently fits because we are losing a lot of the secret synergy that existed in standard Hearthstone, but it is a nice little future proofing that they could do if they decide to reintroduce that type of deck. All right, now for the next Hunter card, which is a 1-cost, 1 attack, 3 HP Quillboard, Thorn Mantle Musician Finale. The next beast you summon gain +1/+1. Haha. At first glance, I would say King Crush. However, this is probably going to be used more as an aggro tool to just buff up whatever really cheap beast that you might have in your opening hand to slam down on turn 2, where you in theory could get a lot of advantage out of this card. It makes a aggro or face hunter deck, depending how you want to call it, much more viable than it currently has been in the last few years, and could be an interesting return of a very classic Hearthstone deck. Now let's get on to the Mage Cards, the first one being Cosmic Keyboard, a 2-cost, 0 attack, 3 durability. After you cast a spell, summon an elemental with stats equal to its cost. Lose 1 durability. Are they trying to make Elemental Mage a thing again? That's actually kind of a shock. I know between this and one of the later cards that we'll be going over, there might be actually enough room for a deck like that to fully come out. We also do see a lot of elemental synergy within Arcane, which may or may not be the direction that you would want to go with a card like this. Most of the time, you're probably going to want to stick this into a big spell mage deck. However, most of the big spell are actually rotating out, and a lot of the really good support for that type of deck is actually rotating out too, which makes a card like this a little less playable than it would have been if it came out in the previous set. Okay, let's get on to the next Mage card, which is going to be Synthesize, a 1-cost spell that adds a random 1, 2, and 3-cost elemental to your hand. Holy shit, this is a lot of advantage for only 1 mana, which means it's probably incredibly playable in a aggro deck. I also am kind of curious about how many elementals exist currently in standard Hearthstone for a card like this to be really inconsistent or really consistent. I think the pool is small enough for it to be incredibly consistent, even if it does discover cards outside of your own class. And it does make a lot of sense why they rotated Radiant Elemental out of standard with the new rotation, because if you could discover a Radiant Elemental off of this, this would be absolutely broken in Arcane Mage. Alright, now for the last Mage card, which is going to be Hollow Technician, a 3-cost, 3 attack, 4 HP. After any minion takes exactly 1 damage, destroy it. You can use this in combination with Wild Pyromancer to wipe out your entire board and your opponent's entire board. The one upside about this card is the fact that they printed it after Wildfire actually rotated out, which means you no longer can scale up your own hero power, thus making this always online no matter when you draw into it. And because it does essentially mean at bare minimum, you're going to be spending 5 mana to remove whatever key minion your opponent might actually want. And while 3 doesn't look like a high cost for a minion like this, I do think it is a little less playable because of the fact that it is a 3-cost minion. Thus, outside of something like Control Mage, I don't think this card will see much play in the end. Now for the Paladin cards, the first one is going to be Harmonic Disco, a 5-cost holy spell that discovers a 5-cost minion, summon it with +1/+1, swap each turn, which means If it swaps, then it'll be a 1-cost minion, giving it +5/+5. Depending on what the pools actually are, is going to probably be how you're going to want to play this in the end. As it currently stands, I can't really think of too many high-cost minions that you would want to discover, so most of the time you're probably going to have to wait a turn when you draw into this, a 1-drop minion instead, since there are a lot of really consistent minions at the 1 mana pool for this card to actually discover, especially in Paladin. If you can hit a minion with Divine Shield, this card is incredibly powerful, but outside of that, I think this card costs a little bit too much to see too much play. Maybe if they lowered the cost to a 3-cost. Now for the next card, which is going to be Disco Maul, a 2-cost, 2-attack, 2 durability weapon with the Death Rattle. Give a friendly minion a +1/+1. Play minions while equipped to improved. Holy shit, this is probably the most abusable weapon out of the entire bunch that were revealed in this set. You can easily abuse this card with a lot of the Dude Paladin support that we do have from Castle Nathria, where you do get additional copies of your recruits into your hand, and then you can just slam those down too. Essentially, on curve, this is going to be incredibly powerful, as it should allow you to buff up whatever minion that you really want to by a lot. Especially if you attack with the weapon before you attack with any of your own minions, thus maybe in theory allowing you to finish off your opponent really quickly. I can't see a world where this doesn't see some play in a aggro-based Paladin deck. Now for the last Paladin card, which is going to be Boogie Down, which is a 3-cost holy spell that summons 2 1-cost minions from your deck. Finale, give them Taunt. Dude Paladin, here again. There's other ways to actually abuse this card, and you probably could easily use this in most aggro-based decks, as it is just a really good advantage tool on turn 3. It allows you to swarm the board, thin out your deck a little bit so you can draw into key combo pieces if you really need to, or bigger minions. And honestly, Paladin looks like it made out really well with this new set. So let's get to Priest, which is going to be Harmonic Pop, a 6-cost holy spell. Deal 3 damage to all minions. Summon a 6/6 Pop Star, swaps each turn, so it'll do 6 damage instead of 3 when it swaps, and summon a 3/3 instead. I think Light Bomb is still in rotation. If it isn't, then a card like this could in theory be really powerful. But if we do still have Light Bomb, I can't remember exactly what's in the core set anymore, especially for Priest. Then a card like this already is overshadowed by a existing card. And honestly speaking, the 3 damage to all minions isn't enough AoE damage on turn 6 to actually wipe out most of your opponent's board, thus making you have to wait until turn 7, which makes this card a little less playable. Now for the next card, which is going to be for Rogue. Mixtape, a 1-cost spell that discovers a copy of a card your opponent played this game. Hey, this is targeted Thief Rogue support, which actually in theory is really cool. It isn't actually that broken of a card. Sure, you in theory could generate one of your opponent's big win conditions, but most of the time this should be incredibly balanced compared to some of the other rogue cards that we've seen in this set. Now for the next card, which is going to be the first Shaman one. Saxophone Solace, a 1-cost, 1-attack, 2 HP, a Murloc. Battlecry, if you control no other minions, add a Saxophone Solace to your hand. There's not much to say about this card. Outside of turn 1, this card is probably incredibly not playable. If you're behind when you're playing a Murloc deck, then you're already going to be losing the game, and this card doesn't help you out in that case. Murloc decks like to swarm the board. I don't see why they printed a card like this, unless they're trying to print some type of menagerie Shaman deck, and there's nothing supporting that style of deck currently in standard Hearthstone. That's making this card just a very big miss in my opinion. Honestly, probably the worst Solace out of the bunch, and that was an incredibly low bar to pull off. Now for the next card, which is going to be Chill Vibes, a 3-cost frost spell, restore 8 health. Finale, summon a 3/3 elemental with Taunt. The Resto Shaman has never really existed in Hearthstone, which is kind of a big shock because it is one of the 3 specs in World of Warcraft, and every time they try to print cards to support such a deck, they never print enough of them. This card is probably playable in theory, as it is a pretty good turn 3 card, as it does allow you to get some type of advantage if you do get the finale bonus on it. I'm honestly assuming this card was printed because of a Jarin scroll, where you can discover a fire, frost, or nature spell, and the pool of frost spells were incredibly small once Alterac Valley actually rotates out, thus making it incredibly consistent. Mania, which is a 0 cost spell that each time you play a minion this turn, add a random Shaman spell to your hand. If you have a lot of mana cheat, which Shaman doesn't really have that much access to, or a lot of really cheap minions, this in theory could allow you to refill your hand after swarming your board on a really early on turn. It honestly might make for some really interesting situations where you're going to want to delay playing down any minions until you can get a lot of advantage off of this, thus allowing you to overwhelm your opponent with both minions and spells on the following turn. The only problem with this is you're not going to have any type of control of what you do randomly generate, and thus making this card probably just a meme in the long run. Alright, let's start the Symphony with Warlock Cards. The first one going to be Sympathy of Sins, which is a 6 cost spell that discovers and plays a movement. Shuffle the other 6 into your deck. And what does it mean by movement? Well, there are 7 deadly sins, so we have 7 movements. The first one being Movement of Wrath, which deals 6 damage to all characters. Movement of Desire, which normally would be Lust, but it is a rated teen game, so it is what it is, which deals 6 damage to the enemy hero. Movement of Envy removes the top 6 cards from your opponent's deck. Movement of Gluttony gives a random minion in your hand, a deck, and battlefield +6/+6. Movement of Sloth summons a 6/6 demon with Reborn and Taunt. Pride draws the highest cost minion within your deck and reduces its cost by 6. And finally, we have Greed that allows you to draw 6 cards. All of these will cost 3 mana, and even if you don't get the movement that you want, the other 6 will be shuffled into your deck, and you eventually can draw into all of these. None of these cards are really bricks on their own, which could wipe your opponent's board, remove the top cards of their deck, thus making them go into fatigue, or even buff up some existing minions on your board. Overall, I would say these feel incredibly balanced between the 7 different options, outside of maybe Sloth and Greed. Sloth could in theory keep you alive for an additional turn, but some of these other options give you just a much better way of doing a very similar thing. Greed also draws you into 6 cards, and if you're going to be playing this card, you're probably going to be playing it in a control style of deck, thus having your hand mostly full, and thus Greed not always being a card that you really want to use unless you don't mind burning some cards. Outside of that, all these other ones have such flexibility that I can't see a world where this card doesn't see play. If for some reason or somehow you actually find ways to discover additional copies of this, you're going to be in a very good position. Now for the next card, which introduces the main theme of Warlocks, Craze Conductor, a 5 cost 4 attack 5 HP minion that has the battle cry, take fatigue damage, summon that many 3/3 imps. Imp Warlock support, but it does introduce the main theme as mentioned before, which is going to be fatigue damage. Now that we don't have the quest line in a rotation, we can explore decks like this. The funny thing is, I'm pretty sure there was someone in the custom card community of Hearthstone that actually came up with a very similar idea too. And while I don't think they combined the idea of Fatigue Warlock with Imp Warlock, I do think this card is incredibly powerful. Sure, the first time you're going to place this down, it is just going to be a 7/8 on board with 2 bodies, which isn't actually that bad in theory, but there are going to be quite a few other cards that you can easily use this in combination with to make it actually work. The other nice thing about this card, and all the other ones that we are going to be going over very quickly, is the fact that even if your hero is immune, whatever damage you would have taken from the fatigue damage will count, and you'll be able to summon all the imps if you do get into very high fatigue counts. At least that is what a Blizzard dev tweeted out after these cards were revealed. Now for the next card, which is going to be Baron Tone Imp, a 2 cost 2 attack, 2 HP, demon, battle cry, take fatigue damage, gain that much attack and health. Imp Warlock has a new fun 2-drop to use that's going to be incredibly annoying to actually deal with, because if you can get this online, even if it isn't on turn 2, it is still incredibly powerful. The longer into the game that you can actually hold out on these, the bigger these actually can get. Thus can actually solve a lot of the issues that Imp Warlock will probably have after the new rotation, losing things like Shady Bartender, where they don't have a really late game plan and they just hope to finish you off very quick. But with a card like this and the previous card, you should have a lot of ways to actually have a very wide board of very big demons. Now for the next card, which is going to be Crescendo, a 3-cost Fell spell. Take fatigue damage, deal that much damage to all enemies. Why couldn't we have gotten this in rotation when Grave Defiler was still here? This card is so good for that deck. It was probably one of the biggest missed opportunities of Alterac Valley out of all the possible decks that were introduced in that set. I get it, they probably didn't want to introduce a card like this with Grave Defiler, since you could get, in theory, very easy additional copies of this using that card, and that would have been an incredibly big payoff. And you couldn't also print this card while the questline was in rotation, because the questline would have just easily abused this and done double damage to your opponent's face. However, I will say with all these new fatigue cards, I think these are a lot more healthy for the game than that questline ever was, because it does also do damage to your own face and you don't have any way to really negate it outside of the new 1-drop imp and the weapon that we will be going over in a little bit. With this card in particular, there are also quite a few ways to actually make additional copies of it through things like School Teacher or anything that would allow you to generate a random spell. If you wanted to, you could probably make an undead Warlock deck using this card and some of the other previous Fatigue Warlock support in order to OTK your opponent in some type of weird aggro-based deck. The only thing about that style of deck is it's going to be losing Phylactery, which could hurt it enough to actually allow you to have enough space to run cards like this in Warlock. Now for the next card, which is going to be the weapon. Bellstring Harp, a 2-cost 0-attack 3 HP weapon. When your hero would take damage per turn, restore 2 health instead. I'll lose 1 durability. So this is what I meant earlier by there are going to be some cards that will prevent you from taking damage from all the previous cards. However, thankfully it's been clarified that even if you don't take any damage from the fatigue, you will still be gaining the very powerful effects on the previous cards, which is always a great sign, because they did actually think that one through, since they are introducing a bunch of cards within the set that do prevent you from taking damage during your turn, making cards like this way better and a lot more playable. Also a lot more healthy for the game, because you no longer just have a passive effect that your opponent can't interact with, and now you have a minion that your opponent can easily remove, or even a weapon that your opponent could also easily remove. Truth be told, while classical music isn't my favorite genre of music, I do think these Warlock cards are probably going to be my favorite of the set, as it does feel like it has a very cohesive theme around it, and it looks incredibly fun to play. Alright, let's get Demonic. Demonic Dynamics is a 3-cost Fell spell. Discover 2 demons. Finale, give them +1/+2. Great for a control Warlock deck where you're trying to get some really high cost minions, or if you really need this early on, you could use it to discover some mid-range minions, so you can actually just focus on lower cost minions in the deck or higher cost minions depending on how you're building it in the long run. I don't think the finale on this card matters too much, as you're probably not going to worry about it. However, being able to discover 2 demons, especially given the small pool of demons that currently exist in Standard, as we haven't really had a demon-centric set in a long time, this card could be incredibly consistent on what you're randomly going to generate. I could see a world where this maybe sees a nerf early on and then a nerf reverted once we do get some additional demons, but until this, I think this is incredibly playable, even if it is a little bit boring. Now for the final Warlock card, which is going to be Dire Despair, a 6-cost shadow spell. Deal 3 damage to a character. If it kills it, summon a demon from your deck. Really, really consistent. It's a better Curse of Doom, I think it was, where you randomly got a demon whenever you killed a minion with this spell from the classic set. And this could, in theory, be used in combination with something like Mal'Ganis, who is back in rotation to give your own hero immunity whenever you do wipe out an opponent's minion. However, I do think this card costs a little bit too much to see too much play in the long run, as 6 mana tends to make things a little bit awkward to try to use in most decks. Now let's get on to the final warrior card, which is Kodohai Drum Kit, a 4 cost 3 attack, 2 durability weapon, death rattle, deal 1 damage to all minion. Gain armor while equipped to improve. What deck does this fit in? Control warrior is the first thought, but why is this the only weapon that actually has a downside out of all weapons that we saw in the set? Seriously. It's an easy fix that you could make for a card like this to just hit your opponent's minions instead of your minions too. I get it, in theory could be used in combination with some Enraged Warrior support, but most of the minions that you're going to run in that deck have 2 or lower HP, and you already have a really good weapon in that style of deck that you might not want to hurt the consistency factor by running a card like this. If you can randomly generate this, sure, you're going to like it then. There's 2 ways I can see warrior going down. The amalgam route, which relies on a neutral card, or mill warrior, which also relies on a neutral card. None of the warrior decks that are currently in standard Hearthstone are going to rely on a non-neutral card as their main win condition. The weird thing about this card is it's actually one of the more playable warrior cards that we've seen in the entire set. The downside is the deck that you want to fit it in is losing so much of its own package that I don't think Control Warrior is going to survive the rotation, outside of maybe using Tony to mill your opponent out. And if that's too strong, it's going to be nerfed almost instantaneously because the class isn't rogue. As a warrior fan, this really sucks, and I really do hope it improves in the nearby future, but we'll have to wait on the mini set or some balancing changes to maybe see some of these cards be more playable. Let me know down below what deck that you're most looking forward to using out of the cards revealed today or in the previous card reviews. I think Fatigue Warlock is almost number 1 what I want to try out, and ironically Mill Warrior is probably also really high up there for possible decks that look like a lot of fun in my opinion. And like always, if you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, subscribe. Until next time, bye bye.